In the 1920s, the nation as a whole had a lot of banks. The banks gave the American people the opportunity to take out loans, save, and invest their money. It was the backbone of finance for America. Nebraska in the early 1920s had 1.3 million people. There was one bank for every 1,000 people. However, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was first inaugurated in March 1933, banks in all 48 states had closed or had placed restrictions on how much money depositors could withdraw. As farmers had less money, banks began to fail at alarming rates. Everything in our economy is closely tied, and banks were more important to our economy than any people realize. There's been a lot of back and forth debate between both scholars and average people on whether the fear of bank failures caused the Depression or the Depression caused banks to fail. Whether the fear of bank failures caused the Depression or the Depression caused banks to fail, the result was the same for people who had their life savings in the banks. It technically began long before Black Tuesday, but that's when the most devastating stock market crash was. It happened in late October. In the wake of the stock market crash of October 1929, people were growing increasingly anxious about the security of their money. Wealthy people were pulling their investments assets out of the economy, and consumers overall were spending less and less money. The bankruptcy became more common, and people's confidence in financial institutions such as banks started rapidly ending. Some 650 banks failed in 1929. The number would rise to more than 1,300 the following year. The Panic of 1930 was a financial crisis that occurred in the United States, which led to a severe decline in the money supply during a period of declining economic activity. A series of bank failures from agricultural areas during this time period sparked panic among depositors, which led to widespread bank runs across the country. A bank run occurs in a fractional reserve banking system. It happens when a large number of customers withdraw their deposits from a financial institution at the same time and either demand cash or transfer those funds into a government bonds, precious metals or stones, or a safer institution because they believe that the financial institution is or might become insolvent. As a bank run progresses, it generates its own momentum. As more people withdraw their deposits, the likelihood of default increases, thus triggering further withdrawals. This can destabilize the bank to the point where it runs out of cash and thus faces sudden bankruptcy. During the 1930s, there were thousands of foreclosures. The word foreclosure itself became a rallying cry for political movements. Foreclosure is the legal process that banks use to get back some of the money they loaned when a borrower can't repay the loan. On March 12, 1933, Roosevelt gave the first of what would become known as the fireside chats, or speeches broadcast over the radio, in which he addressed the American people directly. In that first fireside chat, Roosevelt spoke to the bank crisis, explaining the logic behind his closing of all banks and stating that your government does not intend that the history of the past few years shall be repeated. We do not want and will not have another epidemic of bank failures. The Great Recession almost turned into another depression in America's economy. 8.7 million jobs were lost during the Great Recession. Here is one person's story about how the Great Recession affected them. Carla Sutton remembers her father, David Sutton, as a fun guy. At one time, David had $500,000 in retirement savings and new fixer-upper house in Columbus, Ohio. That was before he lost his job in 2007 when he was 54. At first, Sutton, who had been employed by the same company for 30 years, visited the public library every day to apply for positions. He was interviewed multiple times but never was hired. His daughter believes it was because he was close to retirement age. David Sutton drained all about $30,000 from his retirement funds over the next 5 years, taking on hefty tax penalties for withdrawing early. He racked up $10,000 in credit card debt and large medical bills because he had no health insurance. His house, which he had bought at the height of the bubble, lost its value. David Sutton bought his fixer-upper house during the house bubbling that peaked in 2006. It lost all its value the next year. His story mirrors the stories of millions of other Americans. Banking and the housing system are closely linked. Many people argue that there's strong evidence that the worst performing mortgages were funded through what's called the shadow banking system. It's possible that competition from the shadow banking system may have pressured more traditional institutions to give out riskier loans. Some Americans think that the banks used this money to push up house prices. They think that the banks created too much money. In just 7 years, they doubled the amount of money in debt in the economy. It's agreed that there was a lot more that caused the Great Recession than just that, but it was certainly a factor. When you rely on things or on money that doesn't really exist, then you're really just on your own. It's much easier for even the most detailed plans to fall through mysteriously. It's similar to scams still run today. Very little of trillion pounds of that bank created between 2000 and 2007 went to businesses outside the financial sector. 32% went to the financial sector. The next place it went to was housing. Roughly 31% went to residential property. This caused mortgage prices to go up much higher than wages were. About 20% went into commercial real estate. 8% of all the money that banks created went to businesses outside the financial sector, and another 8% went into credit cards and personal loans. Eventually, the debts became unpayable. At this point, homeowners stopped repaying their loans, and the banks found themselves in danger, or really going bankrupt. A total of 465 banks failed. Their assets and deposits redistributed to the country's remaining 7,176 institutions. This number was smaller than many people feared, but larger than the ideal. This did affect everything else because our economy is fairly intertwined. For example, even today in today's bankings have continued to impose tight lending standards, especially on small businesses. Because of that, small businesses have experienced a lack in cash flow and funding. This forced many to permanently close their doors. Not only did banks struggle, but so did businesses and homeowners. No one was unaffected by the Great Recession.